Hi, I'm Helen Christians. I'll be your MC this morning. It's first Sunday, so it's filled with music. We've been spending the last half hour being entertained by our Pete and Paul and Rob. It's been great. And Hank. And I always do that to you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm so glad to be looking out at so many familiar faces and also on Zoom. So welcome. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead fulfilling and meaningful and ethical lives using reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We do this because this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility of peace and well-being that follows when people are treated with respect.
Shadows are falling and I'm running out of breath. Keep me in your heart for a while. If I leave you, it doesn't mean I love you any less. Keep me in your heart for a while. When you get up in the morning and you see that crazy sun, keep me in your heart for a while. There's a train leaving nightly called when all is said and done. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sometimes when you're doing simple things around the house, maybe you'll think of me and smile. You know I'm tied to you like the buttons on your blouse. Keep me in your heart for a while. Hold me in your thoughts, take me to your dreams, touch me as I fall into view. When the winter comes, keep the fires lit, and I will be right next to you. Engine drivers heading north to Pleasant Stream, keep me in your heart for a while. These wheels keep turning, but they're running out of steam. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was lovely. Very lovely. Well, I'd like to introduce our speaker now, Dr. Jeff Seward. Dr. Jeff Seward was born in Chicago and grew up in an Air Force family. He lived in many places. Along the way, he attended 2 elementary schools, 2 junior highs, 2 high schools, 6 universities, and he earned his PhD eventually in political science from Stanford. He spent 3 years doing field work for his dissertation in Brazil, where he also met his Peruvian wife, Marie. The dissertation eventually turned into a book published by Routledge Press, The Politics of Capitalists Transformation, Brazilian Informatics Policy, Regime Change, and State Autonomy. Prior to arriving at Pacific University in 1990, he taught 3 years at the University of Texas in San Antonio, and before that, worked as a reporter and prize-winning documentary film producer for public television stations in Boise and Seattle. During his 32 years at Pacific, Jeff taught over 40 different courses that have been cross-listed in a multitude of other departments. He has also served as chair of politics and government, chair of the old division of social sciences, secretary and chair of the College of Arts and Sciences, director of the international programs, and the chair-elect of the Faculty Senate, of which he was instrumental in designing and organizing. In 2003, he performed the title role of Pacific Theater and Music Department production of The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. Jeff retired from Pacific University and was in 22 or 23? I can't remember either. It's been there. It's recently.
22.
Recently, and is now professor emeritus at Pacific. Jeff, it is with great pleasure I introduce you for this wonderful program on elections. What are they good for?
The songs, for some reason, got me thinking of an old Roger Miller song. So I just want to sing a verse of that for you.
Yes.
I hear tell you're doing well, good things have come to you. I wish I had your happiness and you had a do, wackadoo, 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 wackadoo. I see you going down the street in your big Cadillac. You got girls in the front, you got girls in the back, and way in the back you got money in the sack. Both hands on the wheel and your shoulders reared back. Rip-it-pip-a-doo bow. That's all I remember. So, elections. When our side wins, they seem wonderful. When our side loses, they seem deeply flawed, even corrupt. The election of 2016 that put Trump in the White House and the current election that may return him there brings to mind an old quotation about elections from H.L. Mencken. As democracy is perfected, the office of president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron. We seem to have reached that point. I'm going to have a lot of questions about elections and a lot of negative things to say about them in this lecture, so I want to make clear right from the start that I believe in elections, and elections matter. If Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, there would now be a 6-3 liberal majority on the Supreme Court instead of a 6-3 conservative majority, and Roe v. Wade would still be the law of the land. Maybe 1 million fewer Americans would have died of COVID, and conservative decisions against voting rights, campaign finance reform, affirmative action, environmental protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, would all still just be gleams in the eyes of Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. There would have been no massive tax cut for the rich and no policy of separating families at the border and losing track of the parents and children to make it impossible to reunite them. And a dozen other things would have been different. I'll let you fill in the blanks. Another Trump victory this fall could result in a substantial unraveling of American democratic institutions. So elections do matter. They are real. You should vote. By themselves are not the same thing as democracy, and they don't guarantee democracy. They are only one element of a healthy democracy, and they can also serve to distort democracy or be a sort of sham exercise that disguises an underlying authoritarian or corrupt reality. They are not the same thing as government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to cite Lincoln's famous phrase. It's traditional to think of modern democracies as inspired descendants of Athenian democracy, of ancient Athenian democracy, in which the assembly of all the citizens governed directly. aside from the fact that the assemblies consisted of only a small minority of Athenians because women, slaves, and immigrants were all excluded from participation, even within the framework of the democratic assemblies, Athenians were deeply suspicious of elections. They considered them anti-democratic because they tended to be dominated by wealth and prominent oligarchic families. Sound familiar? The only democratic method to them was to select public officials randomly by lot among all the citizens. And that's what they did. And they used elections only to select military leaders and officials handling the public treasury. In modern times, socialist radicals on the left, some on the right for that matter, have made this point even more sharply about democratic elections in capitalist societies. Marx and Engels were famously dismissive of bourgeois parliamentary democracy in the Communist Manifesto, when they insisted that, quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So I repeat that. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, that is, the capitalist class. Lenin spelled this out more concretely. Quote, democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. Marx grasped this essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when he said that the oppressed are allowed every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament. And Herbert Marcuse boiled it down even more simply: free election of masters does not abolish the masters or the slaves. Iran has frequent competitive elections. In fact, they just had national elections for their parliament last Friday. They also have competitive elections for president. And the candidates favored by the ruling religious authorities don't always win. But they have what I would call a theocratic primary, in which religious authorities examine the credentials of all potential candidates and cancel any candidates who don't reflect their religious values closely enough or who are too critical of the regime. We don't have a theocratic primary in the US, at least not yet. Atheists are banned from public office in Texas by the state constitution. But we have what political scientists sometimes refer to as the money primary, that exemplifies what the Athenians feared about elections favoring a wealthy oligarchy. In the US, you can't run for office unless you can raise increasingly large amounts of money to finance increasingly expensive campaigns. In the special election in New York recently to replace the wonderful George Santos, don't we already miss him? The Democrats spent just under $10 million on political advertising alone, and the Republicans spent over $6 million on this one congressional race. You can't raise that sort of money from corner bake sales. You have to go hat in hand to rich people who have lots of money to beg them to contribute. And they, of course, want to know if you are sympathetic to their interests and policy preferences. Elected Congress members, immediately after being elected, begin raising money for their reelection campaigns and spend about 50% of all of their time by dialing for dollars. That's what they call it. That is, personally calling up donors to ask for money. It's illegal for them to do this from their official offices. So they all rent little rooms near the Capitol to sit at a little desk with a phone and call potential donors, I'm not kidding, 20 to 25 hours a week. Every week they are in office. That doesn't count time spent in fundraising events. populated mostly by lobbyists. Michelle Nunn, a strong Democratic candidate for Senate in Georgia in 2014, had a goal of raising about $20 million for her campaign. That's cheap by current standards. Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock together raised over $200 million to run against each other in 2022. There was a campaign memo written for Michelle Nunn by her consultants that got leaked to the press. And in that memo, her consultants told her she needed to focus her time on fundraising with relentless intensity. That meant, they said, that she should spend 80% of her time in late 2013 fundraising. And even during the fall campaign, just before the election, should still be spending at least 50% of her time on fundraising. So instead of spending her time communicating with voters in person, she needed to devote most of her time communicating with donors, with wealthy donors on the phone or face-to-face. By the way, she lost decisively to a Republican candidate who was no doubt just as relentlessly focused on fundraising. But it's not hard to imagine the effect over time on candidates who have to spend the bulk of their time soliciting money, primarily from the wealthy. Nor are representatives even remotely close to looking like a cross-section of the American people. That's what the Athenians were trying to accomplish by having election by random lot, to get officers who look basically like a random sample of the citizenry. Minorities and women are radically underrepresented in Congress. And Congress members are notably much wealthier and much better educated than the average citizen. The median net worth of Americans is under $200,000, mostly in their homes. The median net worth of House representatives is about 3 times as much, around $500,000. Senators are much richer. Their average net worth is about $1.75 million. As for education, less than 40% of Americans have a college degree. About 95% of the Congress have college degrees. Not a lot of high school dropouts in the Congress. That's probably a good thing. About 15% of Americans have an advanced degree. Almost 70% of House members and almost 80% of senators have advanced degrees. Every member of the Supreme Court, except Amy Coney Barrett, has a law degree from either Harvard or Yale. They all had degrees from Harvard or Yale before she got on the court. Her law degree is from Notre Dame. A striking consequence of the relatively elite biographies of politicians and their stunning dependence on wealthy campaign donors is the bias in the responsiveness of Congress to different segments of the population. One of the most sophisticated recent analyses about this by a political scientist named Larry Bartels concludes, not surprisingly, that members of the United States Congress are highly responsive to the political views of the wealthy, moderately responsive to the political views of the middle class, and almost completely unresponsive to the political views of the poor. That's why, to cite just an obvious example, the top tax rate on the wealthy, which was over 90% in the 1950s, is now less than 40%. And a recent study of corporate tax rates showed that the largest companies in the country dodged about $275 billion in taxes over the last 4 years. Many paid less than 5% of their profits in taxes, including giants like AT&T, Bank of America, Citigroup, Duke Energy, FedEx, General Motors, Molson Coors, Netflix, and T-Mobile. All paid less than 5% of their profits. And a number of large profitable corporations paid no taxes at all. It's very clear that elected officials are more responsive to their donors than to their voters. So much for government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Compared to Athenian democratic assemblies, where citizens decided all major policies directly by vote, elections are also a very blunt instrument for transmitting public preferences into specific policies. We don't get to vote on specific policies, and we wouldn't know what to do if we did get to vote on most of them. We only get to vote on specific candidates who have only a very general idea of which of their policy positions led to their victory or defeat, because they stood for all kinds of things. Which ones were the ones that people really wanted? As a former Republican senator, Kay Bailey Hutchison, has put it, there are elections in which everyone knows that the people have spoken, but they don't always know exactly what the people have said. So we don't get to control specific policies by elections. This is particularly true since the level of knowledge that the typical voter has is very low, and every political science research into the political knowledge of the electorate has found a discouragingly low level of information. They have only a very general knowledge of the political histories of the candidates or even the current platforms of candidates. Recent studies have shown that voters will agree with a specific policy idea by large majorities if they are told their party supports that policy. And they will oppose the very same policy idea if they are told that the other party supports it. There was a great segment on Jimmy Kimmel the other day. They sent out a person to talk to Trump supporters, and they quoted a couple of ridiculous things that Trump has said recently, but told them that they were things that Biden had said and asked for their reaction. They said, well, this clearly shows that he's mentally unfit for the office and ought to get out. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake in my notes. It was actually Trump who said those things. Now, what do you think of them? Oh, well, and then they made excuses for Trump and said those were fine and they didn't indicate any problem with Trump. So their reaction to the quotations was completely determined by whether their guy said it or the opponent said it. And you would probably get the same thing if you talked to a Biden supporter and did the same thing in reverse. Political scientists who think about political rationality even maintain that voters are being quite rational to be poorly informed. In an election with millions of votes, any individual person's vote can't possibly determine the outcome. People are busy. Unlike the Athenian citizens who had slaves and servants to take care of all their daily business, people today have jobs, children, hobbies, and most of them need to eat and sleep every day. And they don't have slaves to take care of all these activities. As Daniel Bell, a Canadian political scientist, has put it, acquiring knowledge is costly and difficult. Voters in modern-day democracies lack both the time and the motivation to improve their political competence, since their individual vote can't possibly affect the outcome anyway. Or as another political scientist says, citizens are rationally ignorant. This reality of democratic elections, democratic elections, that voters have very low levels of information and also low levels of interest in politics, they're interested in other aspects of life, is a big reason why political campaigns are so ugly. Only big, scary slogans and negative advertisements can catch the interest of most voters. As H.L. Mencken again summed it up, the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. Of course, not all the hobgoblins are imaginary, but the constant appeal to hobgoblins trains voters to give very little credence to politicians' constant alarms. Trump's current hobgoblin is illegal immigration, and his rhetoric about it is full of half-truths at best and usually out-and-out lies. The Democrats' main hobgoblin this year is the threat that Trump poses for American democracy. Personally, I don't think that's imaginary. But the electorate has been trained to take all such radical claims with a big grain of salt. As Otto von Bismarck, the famous Democratic politician of Germany, once said, and I think this is an opinion shared by many ordinary voters, people never lie so much as after a hunt, during a war, or before an election. That's one reason the public doesn't seem that alarmed about the threat of a second Trump presidency. It just all seems like the usual campaign hyperbole. Many voters even seem to have a nostalgia for all the good times of the first Trump presidency, which speaks to the low level of information, again, of the average voter. In any case, elections can only be a small part of a healthy, functioning democracy, even when they are well done. They can be a useful tool for protecting us from tyranny, and when political officials outrage the public, they can be useful for throwing the bums out. Alternating government authority between competing political parties can have a healthy effect on minimizing corruption and the usurpation of power, assuming that the alternating powers are themselves not anti-democratic. George Bernard Shaw summed this up cynically by commenting that democracy substitutes election by the incompetent, many, for appointment by the corrupt few. And those limitations of elections are why it is a big mistake to imagine that we can decide whether a country is democratic or not simply by whether it is holding elections. How about, is there a free and competent press? Is there a vibrant civil society full of associations representing the interests of all the major segments of the population? Are minority rights being reasonably protected? Are elected officials competent and reasonably free from corruption? Are voters or protesters being intimidated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The world today is increasingly full of political arrangements. I talked to you about this in another lecture once, of what political scientists call competitive authoritarian systems, in which there are regular semi-competitive elections, but in which the playing field is so tilted that it's impossible for opponents of the government to ever win. Iran has competitive elections. Putin's Russia has competitive elections. Hungary has competitive elections. Venezuela has competitive elections. But none of these places can be called really democratic. In these systems, elections can't even play the limited role of blocking tyranny or throwing the bums out, because the bums have rigged the rules of the game so severely that the elections are little more than empty formalities. It also makes a big difference what electoral rules you use for your elections. There are a wide variety of electoral systems, even in reasonably democratic countries, and they can generate some very weird, sometimes even pathological results. We all are aware of the pathologies that can be generated by our electoral college system that elected Trump, even though Hillary got 3 million more votes, and came within a whisker of re-electing Trump, even when he lost the popular vote by 7 million votes. But there are strange pathologies associated with every voting system. In the US and the United Kingdom of England, we have so-called first past the post electoral rules for electing members of Congress or Parliament. You don't have to get a majority, you just have to get more votes than all the other candidates, right? This works reasonably well if there are only 2 candidates running. But look what happened in the UK in 1983 when there were 3 major parties running, the Conservatives, Labor, and an alliance of the Social Democrats and the Liberals that eventually became today's Liberal Democrats. I'm just going to refer to them as the Liberal Democrats, even though they didn't quite have that name back then. In that election, the Conservatives won 42% of the total vote, 42%, and they got 69% of the seats in Parliament. Labor got 27% of the vote and got 28% of the seats in Parliament, about like their vote. So Labor got a more or less proportional result, while the Conservatives got a much greater percentage of seats than they got votes. But even worse, look at what happened to the Liberal Democrats. They got almost as many votes as Labor. They got 25%, Labor got 27%. But Labor got 209 seats, while the Alliance got 23 seats. Less than 1/9 of the seats Labor got for about the same number of total votes. How could that happen? Well, the Liberal Democrats, politically, were in the center between the Conservatives and Labor. In conservative districts, they beat Labor, but finished second to the Conservatives and didn't win a seat. In Labor districts, they beat the Conservatives, but finished second to Labor, and so again didn't win a seat. So they got lots and lots of votes, but no seats. Well, they got 23 seats. This has seemed so outrageous to the Liberal Democrats that they've been agitating for a proportional representation system ever since. They joined a coalition government with the Conservatives 10 years or so ago, in part because the Conservatives promised to hold a national referendum on an election reform that would have moved more in the direction of proportional representation. The Conservatives sort of kept their promise. They held the referendum, but they then turned around and campaigned against the reform, and it lost, and they have kept the same system ever since. In the 2019 election, the Liberal Democrats took it on the chin, again, in two ways. Their vote was way down. They only won 11.5% of the vote, and they got less than 2% of the seats in Parliament. At the same time, the Scottish National Party got about 1/3 as many votes as the Liberal Democrats. They got less than 4% of the vote, but they won almost 8% of the seats in Parliament. 1/3 of the vote, but 4 times as many seats as the Liberal Democrats. Well, how did that happen? That didn't seem fair. Well, the Liberal Democrats spread their 11.5% of the vote fairly evenly across the whole country, and that didn't win them many seats. The Scottish National Party, on the other hand, only ran for office in Scotland, which has 59 seats in Parliament. They won majorities in 48 of those districts, and so had 48 members of Parliament, while the Liberal Democrats had only 11, even though the Liberal Democrats got 3 times as many votes as they did. Well, there's something wrong with that system. Many Americans believe that the Electoral College should be abolished and the president should be elected by majority popular vote. Many countries do this, but most insist that if no one gets 50% of the vote, a second vote has to be taken among the top 2 finishers. Very common. They do this in France, they do it in Brazil, they do it in Peru. It's a very common. They do it in Argentina. Sometimes they say, well, if you get over 40% and you won by more than 15%, then you're elected. But usually it's, you have to get 50% or there's another round. Some states do this. Georgia does this with the Senate. They had to have a second round to elect Raphael Warnock, for example. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? But it creates some weird results sometimes. In the 1989 election in Brazil, there were about 8 major plausible presidential candidates from assorted parties, with 3 of them situated more or less in the political center. After the initial vote, the centrist candidates divided the centrist vote, and the 2 top vote getters were on the far right and the far left. The far right candidate got 24% of the vote. He had been over 40% in the polls at one point, but increasingly revealed himself to be an empty suit, all hat, no cattle, as they say in Texas. And so he had become actually quite unpopular, but he still managed to get 24% of the vote. The far left candidate, the guy who's now president, actually, Lula, back then was much more to the left than he is now. He got only 17% of the vote, but that was enough to finish second. So between them, the two candidates who made the runoff only had 41% of the total vote. They didn't even have a majority together. Any of the three centrist candidates could have beaten either of the candidates, but they didn't make the runoff because they splintered the centrist vote. So the country ended up with a choice they didn't really want. Sort of like in the US, if the final choice was between Jill Stein of the Green Party and Ted Cruz. Brazil elected the far right candidate whose government turned out to be a disaster, and he was forced to resign after about a year and a half because of massive corruption. His brother running an operation of selling public policies for money, quite a lot of money, millions of dollars sometimes. A similar election in Peru a couple of years ago produced a second round between two candidates who didn't even have 40% between them. On the right, the corrupt daughter of a former dictator, Fujimori, and on the left, a provincial teachers union activist with no local or national political experience. The leftist teachers union guy won, and his administration was a disaster. He was completely incompetent, and he was removed from office in less than 2 years. Now, the problem in the UK system for parliamentary elections could conceivably be solved with a proportional representation system. But those systems are also often plagued with major pathologies. In a PR system, each party normally comes up with an ordered party list. The party leadership or a party convention puts forward a slate of, say, 100 candidates for 100 seats in parliament, and they are in order. That would have been much fairer to the poor liberal Democrats. If the party, so you got 100 candidates for 100 seats. If the party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20 seats. Who gets the 20 seats? The people who were put at the top of the list before the election. Usually the party leader is number one, and then other prominent members of the party. And it's a list of 100. If you're number 21, you're out of luck because only 20 members of your party got elected. This tends to create strong party discipline, which is often functional for a system. Because if you buck the party or the party leadership, you get put lower on the list or get excluded from the list altogether. So what could go wrong? One problem is there may be a big proliferation of parties, leading to weak and unstable coalitions of parties that may have a hard time governing because of their party differences inside the government. This was a problem in the Weimar Republic before Hitler came to power. Also, elected officials may be very loyal to their parties, but have no direct connection to any specific set of constituents, the way you get in districts in the United States or the United Kingdom. And small and extremist parties can manage to play a crucial role in putting together governing coalitions. Israel, for example, has an almost pure proportional representation system. Throughout its history, it has had two major parties, the Labor Party and a series of major conservative parties. But in the entire history of Israel, 75 years, neither major party has ever won by itself a clear majority of seats in the national parliament, the Knesset, because various minor parties get too many seats. And Labor and the conservatives are usually pretty closely matched, and so they both end up with 40–45% of the Knesset. So the winning party has to form a coalition government with a collection of minor parties, especially parties representing highly religious voters. Israelis are not actually a very religious people, pretty secular country in most ways. But the country has all kinds of religious laws and restrictions because every government of either the right or the left had to cut a deal with minor religious parties to put together a majority coalition. Perhaps the worst result of this has been toleration by both major parties of the proliferation of illegal settlements by Orthodox Jewish groups in the occupied West Bank as the price to pay for sustaining a governing coalition. And the current governing coalition, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, was only able to form a majority coalition by allying itself with extremist and even racist right-wing parties. Brazil has a proportional representation system that is even more bizarre, and I would say it is the dumbest set of electoral rules of any country I know of. I lived in Brazil for 3 years. I saw it close up. They have party lists, like in other proportional representation systems. But for example, in the state of Rio, when I lived there, each party put up as many as twice as many candidates as there are seats. The vote is statewide, so there are hundreds of candidates running for the state's seats in Congress, and voting is for individuals. You can just vote for a party, or you can write in the name of a single particular candidate. All of the votes cast for your party and your party's individual candidates are then added up. So you got 20% of the vote for 100 seats, so you get 20 seats. But the party list is not ordered by party leaders or a party convention. Instead, whichever 20 candidates on your massive list got the most individual votes are the ones who get the seats. So all the people on your list are running against each other in your own party to see who got more votes than the other, sort of running the primary election and the general election at the same time. So the winners owe their election to Congress, not to the party, but to their own individual machines and name recognition. Parties spend a lot of time trying to collect well-known individuals with a big following so that their parties can do well and maybe elect a couple extra candidates. But the candidates don't really have any particular loyalty to the party, at least not always. And they also don't have any connection to a specific district or any clear set of constituents. So there's not party discipline, nor is there connection to local constituents. This leads to the last strange feature of Brazilian elections. When the election results are announced, you still don't know how many seats in Congress each party will have, because before the Congress meets, about 20% of all the elected candidates switch parties to try to be part of the parties that will be most influential in the next government. So only after all the party switching goes on do you know how many people each party will have in the Congress. In the end, there are 15 to 20 parties represented in Congress, and 6 to 8 with significant numbers of representatives. And the president often has only a small minority of the Congress from his own party. Currently, the left-wing president, Lula, has the biggest party in the Congress. But there are 20 different parties represented in the Brazilian House of Representatives. And Lula's party, while it's the largest, has only 68 seats in a body of 513 deputies. So his party is only 13% of the House, and it's the biggest one. This makes governing a matter of attracting votes one by one, often through out-and-out corruption. In a previous term in office, Lula's party set up a system of monthly payments to individual members of the Congress in order to secure their support for legislation. It was called the mensalão, that is the big monthly. This was not just to members of his own party, but to members of other parties who would agree to. During the military regime, they had a Congress too, and they had a similar system where they would buy off individual members of the government. Back then, it was usually by giving them the rights to set up a radio station, which was a very lucrative thing, and there were only a limited number of those, or by allowing them to place X number of people in government jobs. My own favorite system is the German system. They elect half of their representatives to their lower house, called the Bundestag, using electoral districts, like in the US and the UK, with a first-past-the-post system, like we do. The other half is elected via proportional representation. However, to avoid excessive proliferation of parties, you have to get at least 5% of the national vote in order to get any seats in the PR half of the election. This system gives half the members a strong connection to a specific set of constituents in their districts, and the other half strong connection to a political party. Still, they now have 6 major parties represented in the Bundestag, and one of them is a right-wing, almost neo-Nazi party that has used the proportional representation system to gradually build up their vote and are now running second in national polls with almost 20% of the vote. They're very worried about their next elections. There is no perfect electoral system for electing representatives who reflect the values and preferences of the voters. And within each of these systems, there are lots of variations. And I haven't even touched on ranked choice voting, which Portland is going to start using with its new city charter. It has some important virtues, but also some potential problems. A famous political scientist 60 years ago demonstrated mathematically that if you have more than 2 candidates running for an office, if you have 3 or more candidates, there is no process by which you can reflect the majority sentiment of the voters. There's lots of different systems, but they're all flawed. Pacific University, in electing faculty officers to various positions, uses what's called the approval method. It was suggested by a mathematics professor. We've been using it ever since. And in it, you list every member of the College of Arts and Sciences, for example, are listed in a ballot. Or at least all the ones that are eligible for this office, because some aren't eligible because they aren't tenured yet, or they are holding some other office, or are exempt for some. So you have all the eligible candidates, and you mark all the ones that you approve of. You essentially blacklist the ones you can't stand by not approving of them, right? Then everybody's votes are up, and the one who got the most approval is elected. Or the 2 top, I think actually what we were doing was the 2 ones that got the most approval then ran in a head-to-head election. And that has many virtues, but it means that people who might be highly good in the office, but are kind of disliked by 10 or 20% of the faculty, don't have a chance of ever getting elected, and they might be the ones you actually want, even though they're somewhat polarizing. So it tends to elect the nice rather than the competent sometimes. I say this with no bitterness. I was elected a number of times using this system. One of the terrible pathologies in the American system these days is that the electoral rules themselves have now become highly politicized and are subject to political maneuvering in each election cycle, messing with the registration rules, enabling or crippling mail-in voting, outlawing or extending early voting, purging voter rolls in biased ways, et cetera, et cetera. This is very delegitimizing of the electoral process itself. If electoral rules are stable, even if they're imperfect, as they always are, the rules come to be accepted over time as fair. And everyone is playing by the same rules over extended periods of time. We all know what they are, sort of fixed. But if they become subject to political conflict and politicized changes, then that easily leads the losing side of every election to claim that the other side stole the election through manipulating the rules instead of just winning the most votes. If elections come to be seen as not very legitimate because their outcomes are determined by politically messing with the rules, it opens the way for other methods to be used to gain power, especially violent and semi-violent tactics. Many countries have independent election commissions or courts that try to elevate the electoral rules above party loyalties and create stable rules for every election. Mexico, of all places, actually has a very good independent electoral commission and has made its elections much better than they used to be. The current populist president has been under attack because he's been trying to undermine the independence of the independent electoral commission. In the United States, however, who runs our elections? We have state secretaries of state elected in partisan elections, running the elections, and in a position to manipulate the rules of the game. In the Bush versus Gore election in 2000 that came down to Florida determining the outcome of the election, the Florida Secretary of State was a Republican, a partisan Republican, who happened also to be the co-chair of Bush's Florida campaign. And she was running the election. And of course, the final outcome in Florida was determined by a highly partisan decision in the Supreme Court. American democracy is facing many challenges, but the instability and the politicization of the electoral rules of the game worry me as much as any other factor. Of course, all this is only my opinion, and I leave you with the immortal wisdom of George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, who once said in a Yogi Berra sort of way, "I have opinions of my own, strong opinions, but I don't always agree with them."
Oh, Jeff, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, and gave us so much to think about.
I'd like to follow up on what you were saying about the judiciary. There's an old saw about two lawyers, one of whom says, "I know the facts and I know the law," and the other one says, "Yes, but I know the judge."
Yes,
To that, we can add, "Yes, but I appointed the judge."
Yeah.
yes.
What are your thoughts about elections for the judiciary versus appointments?
Well, again, I think there's no perfect system. I mean, it's interesting, you know, after the 2020 election, Trump challenged the results for all kinds of different reasons. And there were 60 court cases, and he lost 59 of them. And the one he won was about a fairly minor technical issue. But a lot of the judges who voted against him were people he had appointed. This has also been true in some of these cases that have been going on. The courts of appeals sometimes have had Trump appointees who voted against them. On the other hand, you have Eileen Cannon down in Florida, who seems determined to just rule whatever way is most beneficial to Trump in delaying the case and so forth. So I think a lot of judges are independent of the people who appointed them, but not all are. If you elect judges, then you have to deal with the low level of information of voters, which is even lower for judicial. Have you ever faced a ballot where you're supposed to vote on the municipal judges and things, and there are two candidates? One is the current judge and the other is challenging him or her, and the voter's pamphlet is not very informative. You know, I'm not in favor of electing judges. They could also then, I mean, you kind of want the judiciary to stand outside and above the party system as an independent force. But if they end up being partisan elections themselves, which they're going to be inclined to do Even if they don't have the party label stuck there, you can kind of figure out who the Republicans and who the Democrats are. Then you've politicized an arm of the government that's supposed to be a reasonably independent check on the rest. Now, I am in favor of Supreme Court reform. My preferred reform would be to put term limits on the justices, say you only get to serve, like we do for the Federal Reserve, you only get to serve for maybe 14 years. So, and you can't be reappointed. That's a long time. And then you'd get turnover. Right now, we're not going to get any turnover on this 6-3 conservative majority for 30 years. They're all pretty young, except for Clarence Thomas. Well, Thomas and Alito aren't too young, but the three new ones are all young, and Roberts is still pretty young. So that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it was just sort of an accident of who was in office at which times. The Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections, and yet there's a 6-3 conservative majority on the court because it just so happened that Bush and Trump were in office when the vacancies occurred. So I do think that we ought to go back to having the American Bar Association vet nominees instead of having the Federalist Society vet the nominees. But I'm not a fan of electing judges.
Thank you, Jeff. Todd, come on in from Zoom. Come on in.
Thank you, Jeff, for another wonderful presentation. I guess one of the things I would like to see, and maybe this is unrealistic, but I do believe that politics has intellect to it, or could have intellect to it. And I believe that if Americans were given the choice of a system where they could truly see what politicians' positions were online on a website, or maybe there was an academy where former politicians served on that academy and vetted the politicians, make it more of an intellectual exercise of campaigning versus the popularity contest and commercials we have now. What do you think of a concept like that?
Well, in terms of having some kind of elite commission that vets candidates like the mullahs do in Iran, who then selects the vetters? Are they democratically elected? Are they appointed by somebody? You then have just sort of moved the problem to another level, and then people are going to say, wow, they declared so-and-so not eligible to run, but he's popular. That's not right. So that's a problem. As far as getting candidates' positions online, they're online. You can go to websites and check out the entire voting record of any congressman or senator or governor or whatever. They have their own websites too, where they show you their current platforms usually and things. The party platforms, when they have them, are available. The Republican parties in the last election chose not to make a platform. For the first time in modern party history, they said, we're not going to have a platform. Instead, they adopted a resolution that basically said, we're in favor of whatever Trump's in favor of. It was really extraordinary. And I don't know what they're going to do this time. I don't know if they're going to have a platform or if they're just going to, again, say, our platform is whatever Trump likes, we support.
We've got a question from Dave Gray.
Yeah, the voters' pamphlets are also something we've done to try and give you information, and I find them reasonably useful. I tend to vote for things I don't know much about by seeing who has endorsed the candidates. So I tend to vote for people that Barbara Roberts endorsed and city council people I like. There used to be a colleague of mine at Pacific named Bob Van Dyke, who was an ardent environmentalist, and he would endorse people in the voters' pamphlet according to whether they were environmentally sound or not. And so I tended to pay a lot of attention to his endorsement. So there's information out there if you want to get it, but it goes back to gathering that information is costly and difficult. Right. I solved that problem by just voting for all the Democrats.
Jeff, we've got a question from Dave.
Don't have to
Here.
gather a lot of information to
Yeah.
do that.
Go ahead,
Uh,
Dave, with your question.
I have two questions. One is.
No, one
it's-
question, one question.
Hmm.
We got lots of people. Quick.
For me, it seems that the open primary is obviously better than having separate primaries for each party. I'm wondering if you agree, or maybe there are flaws in the concept of the open primary. I haven't realized.
Well, I believe in strong political parties. I think they help to organize political systems. You get better accountability. If you have strong political parties, you can hold the parties responsible for what they've done. Open primaries undermine the strength of parties. I'm reasonably open to saying independents should be allowed to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary, although not in both.
No.
But I don't think Republicans should be allowed to vote in the Democratic primary or vice versa, because they end up trying to mess with the nominees of the other party. I think it's good to have a political party determine its own nominees and then run them against it. I'm similarly not a fan of the system that they're now using in California. I think they're using this some in Washington state as well, where all the candidates run in the primary. All the Democrats and all the Republicans and anybody else run in a primary, and the top two vote getters run in the general election. But if you're in a state that's dominated by one party or the other, then one of the parties never has a candidate in the general election. You get two Democrats on the ballot, or you get two Republicans, and I don't think that's helpful for getting, healthy debate. They're having the Senate race in California like that right now, and Adam Schiff is running first in the polls, ahead of Porter and Lee. And so it could be that you end up with just Schiff against Porter. There is a Republican candidate, the former Dodger baseball player, Steve Garvey, is actually running second in the polls now. So it looks like it may end up being Schiff versus Garvey. Personally, I think that's a better outcome than having Schiff running against another Democrat. That way the Republicans get a chance in California, where they are grossly outnumbered, to at least get their positions put before the public, and you get a debate between the two parties.
Thank you, Jeff. Renga, you're coming in from Zoom. Come on in.
What do you think of a proposal to give every voter a positive vote and a negative vote? And he can give it to any of the candidates a positive vote, or the other one a negative vote, and the negative vote will be subtracted from the positive votes. Will that
I kind of like that. That's a little bit like the approval voting system. If you just leave people off your approval ballot, you've essentially done a negative vote.
but on a large scale?
But I think overall, I'm not a fan of that. I kind of like the states where they have a none of the above
Oh.
thing. Nikki Haley in Nevada lost badly to none of the above. She got, I don't know, 15, 20%, and none of the above got 40% or something like that. I think that's a useful way for voters to say, I'm really frustrated by the choice. I think if we had a none of the above in this year's presidential election, it would get a lot of votes, because people are very dissatisfied with having a choice between Biden and Trump. I think that's a useful thing, but a negative vote where if you vote against the person, it gets subtracted, that seems a little harsh.
But
Thank you. Johnny, you have a question. Come on in from Friendly House.
I either heard this or read this quite a while ago, that in the UK, people running for the lower house, House of Commons, are restricted to using the equivalent of $5,000 in their campaign. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know what the exact rule is, but it's very low. And the parties get some kind of public subsidy to run their campaign. I remember a few years ago, an election or two back, and it's not very much. They give them like, $1 million or something for their whole campaign for the whole party, whereas, our party spend maybe $500 million on a congressional election. And a few years ago, Labor got this, and they didn't spend it all even. They gave back a bunch of it because they couldn't figure out how to spend it. We're the only country I know of. Well, Brazil's a little this way too, but we're one of the few countries where we just allow unlimited gobs of money to flow through campaigns, and they distort our campaigns in terrible ways. And there's no reason we have to do that. And I think we should stop. I think we should abolish that and have publicly funded campaigns myself, and give everybody a voucher, give every voter a $100 voucher that they can only spend on candidates or campaigns for initiatives and things like that, and not allow any other contributions. And then people would have equal money to put into campaigns as well as equal votes. And you could give it to third parties. You could give your money to the Green Party if you wanted, or some right-wing nutcase party if you wanted to. And it would give parties other than the Republicans and Democrats some significant resources to work with.
Here's a question from Al Christians. Go ahead, Al.
Jeff, is there anything that you could recommend as far as fixing the election process that would improve elections as much as fixing the income distribution?
One reform that I would suggest is, well, one would be eliminate private funding of campaigns. I would also eliminate paid political advertisements. Instead, have lots of major debates between candidates that were real debates and not competing sound bites. Give people more than a minute to answer a damn question, See if they can talk for 5 minutes coherently about a topic. I also would be in favor of universal voter registration. Everybody who's legally qualified to vote should be automatically registered, permanently registered from the time they turn 18. So there's not all this stuff about blocking people from voting by messing with the registration rules. I personally have been in favor of mandatory voting, which a number of countries have. Brazil has that. Some European countries have it. I think Australia has that. So that you get, we have miserable turnout for our elections, and that has a bias to it as well. More affluent, upper class people tend to vote, and poor people tend not to vote. So those would be the big reforms. And then get some reasonably fair rules in place and stick to them. Don't change them all the time. Don't let the rules themselves every election cycle to become, now we have the lawyering before the elections, and we have the election, we have the lawyering afterwards, that end up mattering as much as how people voted.
Thank you. We have a question from Ann Henderson. Come on in, Ann.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, Ezra Klein at the New York Times just did a blog about Biden not running. I thought it was a really interesting idea. I don't know if you've read it or not.
I did read it, yeah.
And it basically, I could say that, he would say that he wouldn't run for office after we had all of the primaries. He'd say, I'm sorry, I can't run for office. And we would have an open Democratic primary.
And you need to ask your question.
I want to know if you think that that's a viable, it gave me hope. So
Well,
I don't know.
Well, if we knew that in advance so that we could select people at the convention based on them being thoughtful people but the members of the convention are a strange collection of folks that I don't necessarily want them picking the nominee. I read the problem with Biden dropping out is for all his problems and the questions about his age, I think he's probably the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump this year. And the polls seem to show that. What would happen if tomorrow, say, Biden said, I've decided that I'm not able to complete another term, and so I'm throwing it open before the primaries, before a lot of the primaries. The Democratic Party would immediately be deeply divided. Who's the obvious candidate?
Yeah.
Kamala Harris, a Black and Indian woman. But she's not that well respected in large parts of the party, so other people would run against her. If she gets nominated, she would be a weaker candidate against Trump than Biden, probably. If she doesn't get nominated, then Black people and women would all say, oh, look, the white men wouldn't let a Black woman get what she deserved, and so we're staying home, we're not voting. And so it would create this tremendous division within the party. My preferred solution is Biden runs, he gets elected, and next year he resigns.
That would be my
And
vote.
Kamala Harris becomes president, has 3 years to prove whether or not she's a competent executive, and then can run for election in 2028 on her record, for better or worse. And then other people running against her, you know, it wouldn't have the same kind of divisive effect, I think, that it would have now. I don't think, and the other thing is, no other candidate besides Biden has raised any money. They don't have a war chest. And so funding would be a problem for any alternative.
He could give it to him.
That's why he could, well, I'm not sure he could actually, but some of the money that they've raised could go there, Democratic National Committee and so forth. But, you know, if he'd done this last year, maybe, to do it now, I think would just create chaos in the Democratic Party and increase the likelihood that Trump would win the election.
Thank you.
And I like Kamala Harris myself, but
Margie, are you up next?
Yeah.
Okay, come on in.
Is there any hope that is there any hope that we will ever get rid of the Electoral College? I know it has been attempted many times with no success, but I think it is a very unfair system.
it's almost impossible because you need to amend the Constitution. And to do that, you've got to get 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states to agree. And all those people in the Congress, the Senate, the people in the Senate benefit from it. And the small states benefit it. They're not going to vote for a constitutional amendment. There has been a movement to have state legislatures pass laws saying if, let's take 2016, if Hillary wins the popular vote, then all of the electors from my state will vote for the winner of the popular vote. And if all the states would do that, then it would, in effect, the Electoral College would end up reflecting the popular vote instead of not. However, can you really imagine even having that law? Is Mississippi really going to have all its electors vote for Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump? If it comes out the other way this year, if Donald Trump wins the popular vote, is California really going to say, yes, all our electors are going to vote for Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden? It's not clear that these things would actually happen that way. Or if they did once, then there'd be tremendous popular clamor in those states to say, well, that was terrible. California ends up voting for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump lost 2-1 in the state of California. So there are problems with that as well. I'm not sure that that's actually realistic. So I think we're stuck with it, and it's worse than it used to be. You know, when we passed the Constitution, The smallest state was Delaware, and it was 1/10 the size of Virginia. Today, the smallest state is Wyoming, and it's 1/65 of the population of California. In the Senate, if you take the 16 smallest states, their population together is about equal to California. Those 16 states have 32 senators. California has 2. So the disproportion is getting bigger and bigger all the time as our population moves to the more populous states. So bad as it was at the beginning of our republic, it's much worse now, but I don't know what to do about it.
But do you have, Joyce, do you have a question? No, you're okay. Okay. Hank Rob, let's start another round.
Ask your questions now. I'm not going to hang around afterwards
Yeah.
today. I have to be somewhere.
My question is, the popular primary for president, I understand, is relatively recent.
Yeah.
Do you think we did better before?
Maybe. In 1968, who was the Democratic nominee for president? Hubert Humphrey. How many primaries did he win? None.
Wow.
How many primaries did he enter? None.
Oh.
There were only a handful of primaries. John F. Kennedy famously won some primaries in 1960, West Virginia in particular, because he was trying to prove that a Catholic could get Protestant votes, which he proved in West Virginia and Wisconsin. But Humphrey didn't enter any, and he didn't have to, because most of the delegates were chosen outside of the primary system. And he won the nomination. And then there were the riots in Chicago. As a result, we had the McGovern reforms that said you have to have either a primary or a caucus. The caucuses are our leading example of participatory democracy in action. And they are the most undemocratic feature of our electoral system, because so few people show up. And they exclude people who happen to be working the night shift, or disabled people who can't get there, or people who can't find a babysitter, or, you know, they're awful. But you asked about the primary system. Primaries also get very few people turn out, you know, maybe 30% of what turn out in the general election, and tends to be the more highly partisan people who show up. I mean, it used to be that the party bosses got together in a smoke-filled room, and they came up with candidates like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson. They didn't do a terrible job, but it wasn't particularly democratic. I think it would be nice, instead of having all these state primaries, to get rid of the caucuses and then have like 4 or 5 regional primaries. You sort of had the South vote, and then Northeast and Northwest. And those would be big enough and prominent, and there'd only be a few of them. You might get better turnout. But it's not necessarily the case that voters will choose better candidates than party bosses will. And on the Republican side, you know, we got people like Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln and Eisenhower, all of whom did reasonably well as presidents.
Jeff, we've got 3 questions in 5 minutes. Can we do
Okay.
it? Okay. Johnny, we got a quick question.
Okay, this is quick. I just want to mention, Costa Rica has a few laws that are pretty interesting, I think. Is number 1, they're required to vote. But it's not enforced. I mean,
Johnny,
there's no
quick
penalty if
question.
you don't. What?
You got it. Just keep going. Okay, real quick.
Okay. Plus, the big thing for me is it's a national holiday.
Yeah.
When they vote on a national holiday. And also, their president cannot be elected for 2 terms in a row.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that's a law or if it's tradition. Do you know?
Okay.
Jeff?
Probably a law. A lot
Yeah.
of countries have
Yeah.
that rule. I'm not terribly a fan of it, because then it means that the person who's elected doesn't have to worry at all about voters anymore.
Hey.
And that's problematic. There was something else I was going to say about that.
Yeah, what are the chances that what's really important, saving the planet, is going to get ignored?
The chances are high that if Trump gets elected, it will, in addition to being catastrophic for American democracy, it will be catastrophic for the planet. Because he won't do diddly about climate change for 4 years. And it, we are just beginning to finally get people to do something about it, although haltingly. He'll bring all of that to a stop. And another disastrous consequence.
Ready for our final question.
Yes, I believe that between the states, that with the Electoral College, there are winner-take-all states, and there are states in which the representatives are proportional to the vote in the state. Which of those do you think is most reasonable if you have to have an Electoral College?
There aren't any that are proportional to the state. There's a couple that have more than one district. So Maine, for example, has 2 different districts, and they each have an electoral vote. So you could lose one and win the other. States could do that. It's within the state's power to make them proportional, but who's going to do that first? Should California, for example, say, well, we're going to allocate our electoral votes proportionally? Right now, we've got 40 electoral votes that are going to go to Joe Biden. If we do it proportionally, he's only going to get 25. So we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. There was a move by Republicans a few years ago to have Pennsylvania and some other generally Democratic states, but had Republican legislatures to do that so that they could cut into the Democrats' vote. But of course, they didn't want the Republican states to adopt it, just the Democratic states to adopt it. Yeah, and so there's something to be said for that system, but I don't know how you get there politically from where we are.
Jeff, I'm going to have to stop because
Okay.
we've run out of time, but thank you so much. That was fascinating. Really wonderful.